Imagine standing in the heart of ancient Rome. The marble glistens under the sun, legions march with unshakable discipline, and the streets echo with voices from every corner of the known world. Rome isn't just a city, it's the beating heart of an empire that seems too vast, too powerful, too eternal to ever fall. But empires don't collapse in an instant. They erode, one betrayal, one famine, one battle at a time. Behind the grandeur of Roman temples and the roar of cheering crowds, in the Colosseum, cracks were forming. The economy began to strain. Civil wars tore generals apart. Allies became enemies, and waiting at the gates were tribes Rome once dismissed as barbarians, restless, ambitious, and ready to step into the empire's shadow. So how did this Colossus, the greatest empire in history, come crashing down? And why was it the so-called barbarians who delivered the final blow? Let's uncover the truth. Before we dive in, if you love exploring the rise and fall of great empires, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with fellow history fans. It really helps us bring you more epic stories like this one. Now, let's step into the world of Rome at its peak and watch how it all unraveled. Picture the Roman Empire at its zenith around the 2nd century CE. If you could step into a bustling Roman street during this golden age, you'd see more than just a city. You'd be stepping into the epicenter of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. The empire stretched across 3 continents, from the misty highlands of Britain to the deserts of Arabia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers all the way to the sands of North Africa. 25% of the planet's population lived under Roman rule. And to the average Roman, it felt as if their empire was eternal, divinely chosen, and invincible. But what did this glory look like on the ground? The beating heart of an empire. In the capital itself, Rome dazzled. White marble monuments glittered in the sun. The Colosseum stood as both an engineering marvel and a brutal theater of power, hosting gladiatorial games that reminded citizens of Rome's might. The aqueducts, towering stone arches carrying fresh water for miles, were not just practical. They were symbols of control over nature itself. The Roman Forum bustled with senators, merchants, and philosophers. Temples honored gods imported from across the empire, blending cultures into one grand mosaic. A Roman might buy silk that came from China through the Silk Road, spices from India, glass from Syria, or grain shipped in massive quantities from Egypt. Rome wasn't just a city, it was the beating heart of an interconnected world. And standing watch over it all were the legions, the Roman war machine. The Roman legions weren't just soldiers, they were a system. Every man trained to march for days, build a camp from scratch, fight in flawless formations, and dismantle opponents with ruthless efficiency. Their discipline was legendary. To enemies they seemed unstoppable, a steel tide backed by engineering, logistics, and relentless organization. It wasn't just about brute force. The Romans absorbed enemies into their system. Conquered peoples could become allies, even citizens, provided they swore loyalty to Rome. This policy helped the empire expand and maintain control over vast, diverse populations. Rome turned enemies into Romans. But beneath this genius lay an assumption that would later prove fatal: that Rome could always manage outsiders, that its system would always be strong enough to absorb, control, or crush anyone at its gates. Wealth. Beyond measure, Rome was fabulously wealthy. Gold from Spain, silver from mines in the Balkans, and exotic goods from the East filled its coffers. Roads, over 250,000 miles of them, knit the empire together, ensuring goods, armies, and information could flow swiftly. Ordinary Romans benefited too, at least those living in the city. Public baths offered relaxation and hygiene. Massive circuses provided free entertainment. Grain handouts fed the urban poor. To many, it felt like Rome had unlocked the secret to eternal prosperity. But prosperity can be a double-edged sword. Behind the grandeur, wealth bred dependence, corruption, and complacency. The empire was rich, yes, but also fragile in ways few recognized at the time. Cracks beneath the marble. If you looked closely, you could already spot the fissures. The empire's scale was both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Maintaining order across such distances required staggering resources. The frontiers were under constant pressure, with tribes probing Roman defenses. Inside, politics was vicious. Senators schemed, generals competed for power, and emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Ordinary citizens often bore the cost of elite rivalries through higher taxes, food shortages, or conscription. And yet, most Romans believed in the illusion of permanence. To them, Rome's dominance was as natural as the rising sun. After all, hadn't they defeated Carthage, humbled Greece, and even tamed the wilds of Britain? Who could possibly challenge them? The outsiders, watching closely on the edges of the empire, beyond the Rhine and the Danube, beyond the deserts and steppes, lived peoples Rome labeled simply as barbarians. The word wasn't just an insult, it was a worldview. To the Romans, these outsiders were crude, lawless, and destined either to be conquered or ignored. But here's the irony. While Rome saw them as backward, many of these tribes admired Rome's strength. They traded with Rome, adopted Roman weapons, and even served as mercenaries in Roman armies. They were learning, watching, and waiting. The empire, confident in its superiority, underestimated what these so-called barbarians could become. And, in the centuries to come, it would be their determination and Rome's arrogance that would collide in spectacular fashion. A day in the life of Rome's people. To truly feel the empire's grandeur, imagine being an ordinary Roman. Perhaps you're a farmer in Gaul, growing wheat on land secured by Rome's legions, or a merchant in Alexandria, selling papyrus to buyers from Italy. Or maybe you're a young Roman noble, educated in philosophy, writing letters in Greek while planning a career in politics. Life wasn't equal. Slavery underpinned the economy, and the gap between rich and poor was immense. But compared to much of the ancient world, Rome offered stability, law, and opportunity. Even those at the bottom of society often believed they were part of something greater than themselves, the eternal Rome. The illusion of eternity. At its height, Rome was intoxicating. The empire seemed unbreakable, its borders secure, its wealth endless. Citizens believed Rome's greatness was a gift of the gods, a destiny carved in stone. But history has a cruel way of humbling giants. Empires don't collapse overnight, but they do crumble. For Rome, the seeds of decline were already sown, seeds no one in the Golden Age cared to notice. The very roads that carried goods and legions would one day carry invaders. The wealth that built monuments would feed corruption. And the outsiders Rome dismissed as barbarians, they would become the heirs to the empire's ruins. Rome was at its peak, but the higher the peak, the steeper the fall. The fall of Rome didn't begin with a dramatic collapse, but with hairline fractures, small, almost invisible cracks that spread quietly beneath the empire's glittering surface. To the outside world, Rome still looked invincible. Its armies patrolled vast frontiers, its cities buzzed with wealth and culture, and its emperors boasted of divine favor. Yet within, something was beginning to break, a strain too heavy to carry. Think of the Roman Empire as a colossal statue, impressive, awe-inspiring, seemingly indestructible. But the bigger the statue, the heavier the weight on its foundations. Rome's foundations were its people, its economy, its politics, and its military, and all four were buckling under the strain. The empire was simply too vast. Communication across thousands of miles was slow. By the time news of a border raid reached Rome, weeks, sometimes months, had passed. Decisions were delayed, responses sluggish. And while Rome had once thrived on expansion, by the 3rd century, there was little left to conquer. Instead of gaining new wealth and land, Rome was now spending enormous sums just to defend what it already owned. A bleeding treasury, money became a problem, fast. The cost of maintaining legions on every frontier, building fortresses, paying officials, and feeding the ever-growing population of Rome drained the treasury. To make matters worse, emperors began devaluing the currency, mixing silver coins with cheaper metals. At first, it seemed like a clever trick. More coins meant more money, right? But soon, inflation spiraled out of control. Soldiers demanded higher pay to keep up with rising prices. Farmers and merchants struggled. Ordinary citizens saw their savings evaporate. Wealth, once Rome's great asset, was becoming its curse. Political chaos, then came the politics. Rome was never short of ambition, but by the 3rd century, ambition turned poisonous. Emperors were overthrown with shocking frequency. Between 235 and 284 CE, a period known as the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome saw more than 20 emperors rise and fall, many assassinated by their own soldiers. Imagine living in an empire where the man in charge could change overnight, where loyalty shifted with the sword, and where generals were more powerful than senators. Stability, the very thing Rome had once prided itself on, was gone. This chaos didn't just weaken Rome at the top, it sent ripples across the empire. Governors, unsure who to obey, acted in their own interests. Local leaders grew resentful of Rome's demands. Unity, once Rome's greatest strength, began to unravel. A divided empire, eventually, the empire itself was split in two. In 285 CE, Emperor Diocletian divided Rome into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, believing smaller units would be easier to govern. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it was a warning sign. Rome could no longer hold together as one. The East, centered in Constantinople, was wealthy and strong. The West, centered in Rome, was weaker, poorer, and more vulnerable. The stage was being set for the West's downfall. The people's burden as emperors struggled to hold things together. Ordinary people bore the brunt. Heavy taxation crushed farmers. Many abandoned their land, unable to keep up with the empire's demands. Cities, once vibrant hubs of trade and culture, began to decline as people fled to the countryside. At the same time, slavery, long the backbone of Roman labor, was no longer sustainable. Rome had once filled its slave markets with prisoners of war, but with fewer conquests, there were fewer slaves. The economy, dependent on cheap labor, stumbled. The Roman way of life, once seen as eternal, was becoming unsustainable. Pressures. From beyond, and then, beyond the empire's borders, new pressures were building. Barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Huns, were growing restless. Some fled their homelands due to climate change or hostile neighbors. Others were drawn to Rome's wealth like moths to a flame. At first, these groups raided, but soon they wanted more than plunder. They wanted land, safety, and a share of Rome's prosperity. Rome faced an impossible choice: fight them endlessly or let them in. Both choices carried risks Rome wasn't prepared to handle. The armies, transformation, even the legions, the pride of Rome, began to change. Recruiting Roman citizens became harder, as fewer wanted the grueling life of a soldier. To fill the ranks, Rome turned increasingly to mercenaries, often drawn from the very tribes pressing at its borders. These men fought for Rome, yes, but their loyalty was to gold, not the empire. And when the gold ran out, or when their own tribes needed them, the results were disastrous. The disciplined Roman war machine, once the terror of the world, was losing its edge. A shaken identity, all of this chipped away at what it meant to be Roman. Once being Roman meant belonging to something greater, a civilization that stood above all others. But by the 4th century, that pride was fading. Citizens no longer trusted their leaders. The government felt corrupt and distant. The army no longer seemed invincible. When the core identity of a people begins to falter, cracks widen into fractures. Rome was still standing, still commanding awe, but the certainty that it would last forever was gone. Seeds of collapse historians often debate what truly caused the fall of Rome. Was it economic decay, political instability, or military weakness? The truth is, it was all of these, interwoven like threads in a fraying rope. The cracks in the Colossus weren't immediately visible to those living in Rome's golden cities or walking its grand forums. But they were there. Slowly, silently, the empire was becoming vulnerable. And the barbarians beyond the frontier, they could sense it. They saw the cracks, they saw the weaknesses, and soon they would take their chance. Rome was no longer an unstoppable giant. It was a weary colossus, magnificent but fragile, standing on legs of clay, and the blows were coming. For centuries, Rome had labeled anyone outside its borders as barbarians. The word didn't describe a single people. It was a blanket term for countless tribes, nations, and cultures that Rome viewed as uncivilized. To Romans, they were outsiders who spoke strange tongues, wore rough clothes, and lived beyond the empire's shining cities. But the truth was far more complex. These barbarians were not faceless hordes. They were warriors, farmers, kings, and families, and in time they would play the central role in Rome's fall. Who were the barbarians? The so-called barbarians came from every direction. In the north, there were Germanic tribes like the Franks, Saxons, and Alemanni. To the east were the Goths, who themselves would later split into Visigoths and Ostrogoths. From the west came seafaring raiders, and from the far steppes of Asia thundered the Huns, nomadic horsemen whose sudden arrival sent shockwaves across Europe. Each of these groups had their own leaders, traditions, and rivalries. They weren't united. In fact, many were enemies of each other. But Rome's weakness would give them something in common: opportunity. Rome and the outsiders. At first, Rome had managed its borders with a mix of strength and diplomacy. Some tribes were crushed in battle. Others were allowed to settle on Roman lands as foederati, allies who provided soldiers in exchange for food and farmland. This arrangement worked for a time, but it came with risks. Allowing entire tribes inside Roman territory meant giving them power, land, and influence. Rome believed it could control them, but often these new arrivals felt like second-class citizens. They wanted more than Rome was willing to give. Resentment simmered, and when Rome stumbled, they were ready to strike. The Gothic struggle, one of the most significant turning points, came with the Goths. Pressured by the terrifying advance of the Huns in the late 4th century, tens of thousands of Goths begged to cross the Danube River and seek safety inside the Roman Empire. Rome agreed, but badly mishandled the situation. Corrupt Roman officials extorted the starving Goths, selling them dog meat at outrageous prices. Anger boiled over, and the Goths rose up. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Roman army faced the Goths in open combat. The result was catastrophic. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens was killed, and 2/3 of his army lay dead on the field. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and it proved something shocking. The barbarians were not just raiders. They could crush Rome in a battle. Alaric and the sack of Rome. From the Gothic struggle rose one of the most famous figures of Rome's decline: Alaric, king of the Visigoths. Alaric had once served in Rome's army, fighting alongside legions. He understood Rome's strengths and its weaknesses. For years, he demanded land and recognition for his people. Rome stalled, promised, and broke its promises. Finally, Alaric took matters into his own hands. In 410 CE, his forces marched into Italy itself. Rome, the eternal city, the heart of the empire, was besieged. On August 24th, the unthinkable happened. Rome was sacked. The shock was indescribable. For 800 years, Rome had stood untouched, the symbol of civilization's endurance. Now, its streets were filled with fire, plunder, and despair. Though Alaric spared many lives and sacred sites, the psychological blow was devastating. The message was clear: Rome was no longer invincible. The Vandals' sweep. In the Goths were only the beginning. Soon, other tribes pressed in. The Vandals, migrating from Central Europe, carved a path through Gaul and Spain before crossing into North Africa. By 439 CE, they captured Carthage, Rome's vital grain supply. Without North African wheat, the Western Empire struggled to feed its people. The Vandals then built a powerful navy and became masters of the Mediterranean. In 455 CE, they too sacked Rome. This time, the looting lasted for 2 full weeks. Unlike Alaric's relatively restrained sack, the Vandals stripped the city of treasures, artworks, and anything of value. From this act, the word vandalism would forever be linked to destruction. The Hunnic storm, yet perhaps the most terrifying. Threat came from the east, the Huns. Led by the fearsome Attila, they were unlike anything Rome had faced before. Masters of horseback warfare, they struck with terrifying speed, burning towns and villages before Roman legions could even respond. Attila's campaigns spread panic across Europe. Whole communities fled at the mere rumor of his approach. Rome tried to buy peace with gold, but Attila demanded more each time. In 452 CE, he even marched into Italy, threatening Rome itself. According to legend, only the intervention of Pope Leo X convinced Attila to withdraw, though famine and disease among his troops played a role too. Still, the image of Rome begging for mercy from a barbarian king showed just how far the mighty empire had fallen. Barbarians within, by the mid-5th century, the barbarians weren't just at the gates, they were inside. Many Roman generals were of barbarian origin. Armies were filled with Gothic, Vandal, and Frankish recruits. Some fought loyally for Rome. Others used their positions to further their own people's power. This blurred the line between Roman and barbarian. Rome was no longer defending itself against outsiders. It was being reshaped from within, a new world emerging too. Romans who lived through it, the barbarian invasions felt like chaos, destruction, and betrayal. But from another perspective, it was the birth of a new world. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, and others weren't merely tearing Rome down. They were laying the foundations for medieval Europe. They built kingdoms on former Roman lands, blended Roman traditions with their own, and kept parts of Roman culture alive even as the empire crumbled. Latin survived. Christianity spread. Roads, cities, and laws continued, though under new rulers. The barbarians hadn't just destroyed Rome, they had transformed it. Rome's broken pride. By now, the image of Rome as an eternal, untouchable power was gone. The sackings, the defeats, the loss of provinces. It all shattered the illusion of permanence. For centuries, Rome had looked down on the barbarians as outsiders. But in the end, it was those same outsiders who dictated Rome's fate. They were no longer the nameless masses. Beyond the frontier, they were kings, conquerors, and heirs to the empire's legacy. A foreshadowing of the end as the 5th century wore on, the Western Roman Empire was reduced to a shadow. Its lands shrank, its coffers emptied, and its leaders grew weaker. The barbarians weren't the sole reason for Rome's collapse. Internal decay had paved the way. But they were the final push, the storm that toppled a weary giant. And soon the last emperor of the West would fall, not to another Roman, but to a barbarian leader. By the late 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was staggering on its last legs. What had once been the world's most powerful state was now little more than a fractured shell, desperately trying to hold itself together. The Senate still met, the emperors still wore their crowns, and coins still bore the proud name of Rome. But everyone knew the truth. The empire was crumbling. The puppet emperors, the final emperors of Rome, were not like the mighty Caesars of old. They were often children, puppets placed on the throne by generals who wielded the real power. The army no longer answered to Rome. It answered to strong men, many of them of barbarian origin. One of the most powerful of these generals was Flavius Aetius, sometimes called the last of the Romans. He had once held back Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE, but he was assassinated by his own emperor, Valentinian III. That assassination removed Rome's last capable defender, leaving the empire exposed. Without strong leadership, Rome spiraled deeper into weakness. Provinces were abandoned, tax revenues dried up, and corruption flourished. Provinces lost forever. By this time, much of the Western Empire had slipped away. Britain was gone, abandoned to fend for itself against Saxons and local warlords. Gaul had fallen to the Franks. Spain was carved up between Visigoths and Suebi. North Africa, Rome's breadbasket, was firmly in the hands of the Vandals. Each lost province meant more than just territory. It meant the loss of vital resources, tax income, and soldiers. Rome's empire, once stretching from Scotland to Egypt, was now reduced mostly to Italy itself, a battered heart with no arteries. The last emperor in 475 CE, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus, was placed on the throne. His very name seemed like fate. Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, and Augustus, the first emperor. But this Romulus would not found anything. He would preside over the empire's end. Romulus was barely a teenager, and his reign was symbolic. At best, the real power lay with his father, a general named Orestes. But Orestes made a fatal mistake. He refused to grant land in Italy to the barbarian soldiers who formed the bulk of his army. CE is remembered as the official fall of Rome. The Eastern Empire survives, yet Rome did not vanish completely. In the East, the Byzantine Empire, what we now call the Eastern Roman Empire, continued to thrive, ruling from Constantinople for another 1,000 years. Its people still called themselves Romans, and its emperors still saw themselves as heirs to Augustus and Caesar. But the West was gone. Its cities shrank, its roads crumbled, and its population fell. A new age had begun, the Middle Ages. Life. After the fall, for those living through the collapse, the fall of Rome wasn't a single event. It was a slow unraveling. Some cities declined into ruins, while others became centers of new barbarian kingdoms. Trade routes withered. Learning retreated into monasteries. The grand theaters, aqueducts, and forums of Rome were abandoned or repurposed as quarries for stone. To the average farmer or villager, life grew harsher and more uncertain. The stability that Rome's armies and laws had once provided was gone. In its place rose a patchwork of smaller powers, each struggling for survival. Yet the world did not descend entirely into chaos. The barbarians who took over Roman lands often adopted Roman customs. They minted coins, issued laws, and in many cases converted to Christianity. Rome had fallen, but its influence lived on. The legacy of Rome. In fact, the legacy of Rome is one of the most enduring in all of history. Even after the empire's fall, its language, laws, and culture continued to shape the world. Language. Latin survived, evolving into the Romance languages we know today: Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Romanian. Law. Roman legal principles like contracts and property rights became the foundation of European law. Engineering. Roman roads, bridges, and aqueducts continued to be used for centuries. Religion. Christianity, once persecuted in Rome, spread across the empire and beyond, becoming the dominant faith of Europe. Even the idea of empire itself, the dream of ruling a vast territory under one system, was a Roman gift. Centuries later, leaders from Charlemagne to Napoleon to Mussolini would look to Rome as their model. Was it really the end? Historians often debate, did Rome truly fall, or did it simply transform? The Western Empire collapsed in 476, yes, but its spirit carried on in countless ways. The Byzantines called themselves Romans until 1453. The Catholic Church preserved Latin and Roman traditions, and the very idea of Rome became a symbol of power, order, and civilization. Rome may have died politically, but culturally, it never disappeared. Lessons from the fall of Rome has fascinated scholars for centuries. Why did such a mighty empire collapse? Some point to internal decay, corruption, overtaxation, political instability. Others emphasize external pressures, barbarian invasions, economic disruption, and the rise of new powers. The final word, in the end, the fall of Rome, was not just the story of defeat. It was the story of change. The Roman Empire gave way to a new world, a world of kingdoms, knights, and cathedrals, a world that would eventually give rise to modern Europe. The barbarians may have toppled Rome, but they also carried its torch forward. The empire's ruins became the foundations of the future, and so Rome's fall was not the end of history. It was the beginning of a new chapter.